Hey everyone, Shane here from Why We Do What We Do, and I just wanted to give a quick preface to this episode. We've recorded the abortion episode in 2 parts to share some information about and dispel some myths about what abortion is. At the time of the recording, we had recorded it about a week and a half prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So some of the information that you'll hear in the episode is in reference to what could happen in the event that Roe v. Wade is overturned. Unfortunately, we have seen that happen, and it's a shame. We tend to, at this show, when we share information, we tend to try to share as many different viewpoints as possible. When we approach an episode, we do approach it from a pro-science standpoint, and this episode is 100% pro-science. However, Abraham and I do feel that it is important to make it very clear that we stand with women and birthing people during this time. We will continue to provide resources and continue to provide support for those who are directly affected by this just absolute travesty of democracy in our time right now in the United States. So we want to make that really, really clear that at the end of the day, what is going on is absolutely disenfranchising and completely wrong. It's not science-based. It's not even really morally based. It is a control-based issue. It's unfortunate that we're seeing this now. So please know that here at Why We Do What We Do, we stand with you. We are going to leverage this platform to do what we can to support those who are directly affected and hopefully continue to do good work from a pro-science standpoint. So we just want to kind of give that caveat before this episode. We hope that you enjoy it. And more than anything, we hope that you take this information and you arm yourselves with this information as you go forward to fight the big fight that is about to come. So thank you, and please enjoy this listen.
You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your feminist host, Abraham.
And I am your I totally believe in your rights and they should be protected host, Shane.
Yes, we are a psychology podcast. So if you're joining us for the first time, you're in for a ride because we just came off of talking about a light topic with plagiarism and on into one of the heaviest topics we have ever tried to cover.
Yes, we are talking about abortion today. And so, with the necessary disclaimers and stuff, if you've ever listened to the show, then you know our particular bias towards just kind of general policies and humanity and stuff. But we did try to take some time on this one. This is a sensitive topic. So if you are feeling unsure that you're ready to listen to it or uncomfortable, then you can skip to the next episode, which will be, I don't know, I think we're going to cover hair or something like that, which I think is going to end up being a pretty heavy topic in itself.
Yeah, weirdly.
So more than anything, though, we really want to just kind of make sure that that we've talked about this episode for some months now.
Yeah.
And it was assigned months ago, and I have been trying to work on some notes and make sure it's been sensitive and it's been clear and as objective as possible and try to debunk some myths. And there are some wild myths that are going to come up in the second part of this.
For sure.
The goal is ultimately just kind of illuminating people on what it actually is in the current light of kind of the world around us and what's going on.
Yeah, appropriate. And so we're pretty clear that given the scope of this topic and that we want to give enough space for nuance and conversation to occur, that we are planning to split this into 2 parts. So this will be a part 1 today, and then we'll finish up next time. I mean, it's possible to go 3, but I'm not really planning on 3 at the moment.
Yeah.
We'll see. I guess we'll see what happens. But anyway, I believe that it was actually your idea that you pitched doing this topic. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was after the leak from the Supreme Court about overturning Roe v. Wade.
Right.
And it was kind of one of those discussions that is, it's always kind of a point of contention. And there are a lot of different arguments for and against. Right. There are a lot of different discussions around it. But mostly, and this is something that's kind of a value, I think, of ours as a podcast, is that there's a lot of misinformation about what it is and why people do it and some of the statistics around it.
Yeah.
And some of the other choices that are quote unquote viable options. And so we're going to talk about all of that stuff and kind of unpack that in a way that will kind of debunk some of the misinformation that's out there.
Yeah.
And hopefully share information about what this actually means, why people do it, the impact of this stuff, and those different options and myths that people talk about around this.
Yeah. Just as you said, there is science to unpack here, and there's an important understanding of the psychology that's involved in situations where you're faced with what I feel like I'm trying to avoid really loaded terminology, but when you're faced with a situation where you might be considering options of that nature, what is going on there? And I think also understanding that it is so much more complex than it seems to be outright. And there's a lot, as you said, a lot of misinformation is really important to try and unpack. And so there's a lot of preamble on that. And so just before we jump into the full discussion here, thank you for joining us. If you do like this show and you'd like to support us, you can like and subscribe, leave us a rating and review, buy some merch, join us on Patreon, all that sort of stuff. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this discussion. And I will say also, I'm thinking about the fact that with our listeners, they're probably, the people who have been listening to us and continue to listen to us, a lot of this is not going to be necessarily new information, but I'm hoping there's enough new information, enough, I guess, additional sort of content, nuance, and discussion to at least help you feel like you're walking away with something. But I'm also hoping that there are people who are not as familiar with this topic for whom this is going to be a much more thorough treatment than they've ever sort of heard before.
I think even if you are familiar with the discussion, I think that this will be a helpful resource for when people are having those arguments and making comments and stuff, and you can kind of arm yourself with information that we share here. So
absolutely, yeah, and that's something that I appreciate because I feel like a lot of this information was stuff that I kind of had known, but I always just like learning more and sort of solidifying things that I thought maybe that I did know and then getting a little bit more information to support, yes, that's correct, or information saying, not quite exactly that way. It's a little bit different. So yeah. I'm feeling good about it.
Yeah, cool. All right. So before we really, really, truly start on this, we do realize this is a difficult discussion for many reasons. It might be personal, it might be emotional. Between belief that abortion is inherently good or bad, or folks who have struggled with their own pregnancies, we recognize the sensitivity of this topic. We also recognize, as two people who do not have a uterus, the experience is not ours to have.
Fact.
However, we do hope that this episode sheds some light on this topic in an educational way. And as always, we are pro-science on this podcast, and that bias will show throughout the episode. Despite that specific stance of being pro-science, we hope to convey the complexity of this topic in a way that leads to an honest and thoughtful discussion.
I'm ready.
All right. So, as always, I think it's really good to start with some definitions and background, right?
Yes.
All right.
Perfect. So the definition, again, we're talking about abortion here. The definition is the deliberate termination of a human pregnancy, most often performed during the first 28 weeks of pregnancy. So this is different in a way from preventative medicine that would be like preventing getting pregnant in the first place. Although, as we'll see, it hasn't always been that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So now the first documented evidence of an abortion occurred in 1550 BCE in Egypt. That's as old as the practice has been that we know of. And we'll talk about different ways that kind of stuff came up. But there have been various abortion practices that have occurred as an official medical procedure since at least the 1600s. So around the 1600s, in that time, there were people that came out that were quote unquote doctors that were like, we can do this. Here's a medical procedure. You can go see somebody and actually have this procedure done.
And attitudes toward abortion have been complex and have varied across groups. For instance, the Stoics believed that the fetus was more plant-like. Okay. And thus abortion was more acceptable. I'm guessing because it takes root, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure how much they knew about it.
Yeah, I mean, philosophers were wild. So, they had some really interesting thoughts. But specifically, Aristotle raised the question of what it means to begin life, stating, quote, the line between lawful and unlawful abortion will be marked by the fact of having sensation and being alive, end quote. So that's like the philosopher's argument always, right? Like, isn't that always the thing? Right. It's like there's some argument to have within that. But I think it's important to note that this practice in this conversation is as old as at least Aristotle and ancient Egyptians. Yeah. So like this is a long running argument.
And that's an interesting definition that he provides there, or I guess line of demarcation, if you will, because that actually is one of the clearest that we will have seen up to this point. Even though if you really think about it, like how would you know that one has sensation and aliveness? Like what does that mean?
Right.
While it does sound at least initially appealing, once you start to scrutinize it, it starts to feel a little less tenable as an option. Now, of course, biblical references and interpretations of abortion are fairly ubiquitous. While some folks argue that God does not regard the fetus as having a soul, as Exodus 21:22 through 24 and Numbers 5:11 through 31, in these scriptures, the loss of pregnancy did not carry the same weight of the law And high priests would intentionally induce abortion procedures in the event a wife was unfaithful. So again, like, you don't deserve to have this baby with somebody else because you're married to this person.
Yeah, the Bible's real dark.
So specifically sanctioning that.
Yeah, so the specific scripture that a lot of people for and against abortion talk about is that essentially it makes an argument. If there's a fight and somebody in the fight strikes a pregnant woman and she ends up miscarrying the baby, that person is not charged for murder of the baby or for the miscarriage, which is the argument and the interpretation that, like, well, they don't put as much weight on abortive practices and stuff like that. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Now, it wasn't actually until 1821 that abortion was outright banned in the United States. And this took place in Connecticut, of all places. And what they did was they banned abortion after what was called the quickening.
Oh, isn't that in Highlander when you you come back to life or something?
I think it is. Is that what is that the phrase? Is that what it is?
I thought it was called the quickening.
I haven't seen Highlander in many, many, many years.
Okay.
I also learned that, like, one of the actors in Highlander it wasn't the same actor. Never mind. Forget I said anything. I was thinking it was like, you know what it was? Is it's the guy that plays Raiden in, I think, the second Mortal Kombat movie was supposed to be in Aliens and ended up getting dropped out because of cocaine or something, or heroin. Wild stories. So the quickening is actually a term used to describe the first sensations of feeling the uterus move. So the mother would start feeling the
uterus or the fetus?
Sorry, the fetus is what I meant to say.
Okay.
Two different things.
No worries.
When the mother starts feeling the fetus move, that's called the quickening.
Back to the hysteria and the wandering womb.
Yeah, exactly. Remember, this is 1821. This is also a time where you could just shoot somebody for lying to your face. Like there's all kinds of wild things that are going on back then.
Or for any reason at all.
Yeah.
Particularly if they had darker colored skin.
Yeah, and also horse thieves.
Oh, sure.
That's actually like the biggest crime back then.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, in some instances, abortion was banned due to its high death rate, meaning of the mother. New York had a nearly 30% death rate for legal surgical abortions in the 1800s. And this, of course, led many folks to want to ban abortion altogether due to the risk that it posed to pregnant women. It just wasn't very safe at that time. And that's a really high mortality rate for that common of a procedure.
I would make the argument here that is a fairly pragmatic concern. Right? Like that is like a lot of people are dying in this procedure. We should probably either improve this procedure or we got to do something about this. And I don't think the outright ban is the way to go, but it is. I think that they are going, this is a problem at least. And so, so at least they're kind of recognizing that. During that time, though, there was advertising that began to showcase abortion topics. So like in the 1800s, you would start finding actually some of the posters that I saw were really, really cool.
Interesting.
Very much so, like step up to Mr. Blarney's tonic and juice like blah, blah, blah. Like one of those things where it's really, really cool.
Okay.
If you get a chance, you should go and check out these posters. Like this is like a mid-episode recommend.
Bonus recommend.
Everybody go look up these posters because it's really, really cool.
So what term should they Google if they're looking for this?
You should look up abortion flyers from the 1800s is really what you should look. Like flyers and posters and advertising from the 1800s. There's like a whole cool history of it. My favorite is the one, it was for abortion pills. And it was like, what are the wild waves saying? Try Beecham's pills. And they were just called Beecham's pills and not like they weren't named after the medicine or like it was, it was really interesting. Yeah. Like it was very, very unique.
Just like, oh, I have a headache, I should take this pill. And then, oh no.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. Like you go buy a tin of Beecham's pills and you're like, okay, so I'm all set. I'm good.
Right. Yeah. And actually I know that the idea of generally, and there's a lot of mysticism around this in the past of people taking certain herbs and concoctions to try and end pregnancies early. And that was kind of just commonplace because it was, even if you weren't going to try and have a medical procedure because it either didn't exist or you didn't want to, or you couldn't afford it, whatever the reason might be, like having a baby was very dangerous. And there was definitely no protection with respect to if something went wrong, like bummer for you, you know?
Yeah.
So,
well, and we're going to talk about some of those like ancient kind of like those different practices because I think it's worth getting into, like definitely talking about the herbs and the concoctions and different things to induce miscarriages and induce abortions and stuff like that. So we are going to dive into that because that is really fascinating too. But it's very much so in line with just general medicine.
Right.
Like everybody's just like messing around and finding out. Like essentially they're just testing stuff and you know, it's very much so that meme that's around that's like, oh, you got ghosts in your blood, do cocaine about it. Like that's very much so what like medicine has evolved from.
Right.
And you'll see that here too.
And devolved back into, well, not medicine itself, but some of the people out there who are trying to self-medicate.
Yes.
So Interesting tidbit here. Susan B. Anthony was apparently openly opposed to abortion, but not the way you think. In awesome smash the patriarchy fashion, she wrote that the abortion problem was ultimately a man problem. So quoting her, anti-abortion laws would be only mowing off the top of the noxious weed while the root remains. No matter what the motive, love of ease, or a desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. It will burden her conscience in life, it will burden her soul in death, but oh, thrice guilty is he who drove her to the desperation which impelled her to the crime. End quote. So
yes.
I think takeaway there, a woman is guilty, but a man is more guilty. Lacks autonomy in some ways, though, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like one of those things where it's like, I am all for the general sentiment, like the underlying sentiment. Do think it's like a misplaced, like, you know, there is like that piece where it's like, oh, well, like, does the woman not have any like, you know, choice or autonomy in this space? Like,
right.
I feel like that was kind of a weird thing, but I do like that she kind of took that route where it's like, it's not just her, like it's very much so it takes two to tango type of situation.
Yeah. Well, before we start talking about shifts in attitudes over time, shall we take a quick break to let the people start writing their hate mail to us?
Yes. Review bombs. Here we come.
All right, we're back. And so we are talking about in the early 1900s.
Yeah. So in the 1920s and 30s, we began to see a shift in attitudes toward abortion laws and reproductive health. It's really interesting. It's like right before the war, you know, you start seeing like flappers coming out and stuff like that. And like a lot of like those movements, which are really, really cool.
Sure.
And I say 1920s because the 2020s not nearly as cool in some ways, Okay. Like I realize that could be taken out of context. Like, yes, there were groups of people who could not vote and all that stuff. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the fashion more than anything. Go read Great Gatsby, you know. With the invention of birth control and kind of going back to the idea of contraceptives and like preventative medicine and the ongoing development of safer abortion procedures, laws were beginning to be passed that allowed abortion in the event that it would save the mother's life. So where it was outright banned before, now they're loosening that up and saying abortions are allowed as long as it's a life-saving procedure. So now you're kind of starting seeing like that kind of attitude shift towards more, we have to save somebody's life. We have to protect this person's life. And if they can be saved without an unnecessary, like with a procedure and have no unnecessary death, obviously we want to do that.
Yeah.
But I do also like the idea of like birth control kind of starting to take shape and maybe people having those conversations around that too.
Yes. Now, many of these changes were taking place across the world. There were new laws being passed in Canada, Russia, Spain, and Great Britain, among other places. Those are the sort of Anglo light-skinned places.
Yeah, those are the main ones that they were referenced specifically.
Got it.
As main like abortion laws, but there were, I believe they mentioned China as well.
Oh, okay, interesting. So in other places, however, abortion laws did remain fairly strict, and that's still obviously the case today, with bans not only criminally charging those receiving abortions, but those who performed them, so trying to get at it from both ends.
Yep.
And one of the most notable changes to abortion law took place in 1973, and this is the one that everybody knows about. This is the well-known case Roe v. Wade. So 1973, not as far back as you might have thought, only about 50 years.
Yeah, my dad was almost a teenager at that time.
Whoa. All right. We're old.
Yeah.
So let's explore the Roe v. Wade topic, since that is kind of at the center of the abortion discussion in the United States today.
Yeah. I think obviously the reason we want to cover this is because it is so impactful on abortion laws and rights. But I do think what people assume about Roe v. Wade is that it is designed to make abortion illegal everywhere. And that's not quite what it is. So we want to kind of maybe spend some time unpacking that. So Roe v. Wade, 1973, is a landmark class action case challenging the constitutionality of Texas abortion laws. So great, Texas is back. Of course, it started with Texas. Yep. And now, of course, it's coming back. So the main argument of the case was that restrictive state laws were essentially state overreach and that the Constitution protected women's autonomy over their body. Specifically, the ruling was in favor of Roe by citing the 14th Amendment. And so we're going to kind of unpack what that 14th Amendment was a little bit, since people love to argue the Constitution.
Right. And a lot of people love to think that they're constitutional scholars and they can't tell you any one word from the entire Constitution, which isn't that long.
I think also, too, we should probably clarify, we are also not constitutional scholars, and legalese, very difficult for me to read. However, I do think it's worth kind of taking some time and unpacking the clauses within this particular amendment.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you're exactly right. I'm not claiming to have any special knowledge about the Constitution. I can recite like part of the first sentence, the part that everybody knows, obviously. And then I'm vaguely familiar with several of the amendments, although I forget some of the orders sometimes. And I know some of them more than others. Anyway, point being, we're informing you now.
Yeah.
So the 14th Amendment states, and we're going to put this in more or less layperson terms so that you don't have to listen to legalese. So this is the Citizenship Clause. The section of the amendment outlines citizenship and nullifies decisions like Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, which stated that Americans who descended from slaves could not be citizens. There was also a privileges or immunities clause, and based on what we were able to find, it's noted that this clause does very little in general, but
yeah.
It's worth noting that the clause states that, quote, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, end quote. And that actually is a really important piece of how this got tied into the Roe v. Wade, is that specific sentence there.
Yeah.
There's probably some room for interpretation. People have been interpreting it in different ways, which is the case with all text where you choose to sort of idolize it. But there it is.
Yeah.
There's also the Due Process Clause. This clause prohibits state and local governments from depriving people of life, liberty, or pursuit without fair procedure. We'll come back to that one. And then the Equal Protection Clause. Then this clause requires each state to provide equal protection to all people, citizens and non-citizens, within its jurisdiction. I like that one.
I like that one too. I love that's the one when people get like all up in arms about immigration and stuff. It's like, it's in the Constitution. There it is. Like, we have a responsibility to protect everybody, so shut up about it. But so I think one thing that's like kind of interesting, and one thing that I realized as I was unpacking this, was that in the amendments, there are unique specific clauses that may not be directly related to one another, but they are important and are binding, right? So like, the only way to undo the 14th Amendment is to create another amendment that nullifies that amendment, right? So that's kind of how that document is designed to work.
That's how it worked with Prohibition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's two amendments related to Prohibition, one putting it in place and one taking it away.
Yeah.
But I think what's cool is like there are these unique clauses. And so under the 14th, the Citizenship Clause doesn't really necessarily impact abortion rights, but the Privileges and Immunities Clause and the Due Process Clause are the ones that are really impactful. And then also the Equal Protection Clause to some degree. Now, in the ruling of Roe v. Wade, it was determined that under specifically the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, that a woman's right to privacy could not be infringed upon. And this was interpreted that any medical decisions, including abortion, because that was falling in line with medical procedures, could not be unreasonably controlled by state or government or local government, as this would be a legislative overreach. So essentially what they're saying is, under that ruling, under the due process, that states cannot restrict necessary or elective medical procedures.
Yes, very important. And you can see sort of how they were able to connect those dots there. And that is kind of how a lot of people, when they're dealing with constitutional issues or trying to cite the Constitution in defense of a particular point, will, interpret it. And that's fine. It is what it is.
And that's also why, like, you'll find people like introduce laws that end up redefining things.
Right.
So one thing that you might see, one strategy you might see would be that a legislator might reintroduce a new definition of what abortion is. And then once they do that, they can redefine abortion within their state. And then they can go, oh, you can't do that in the state because it is part of this versus this. I forget what state it was, but some state just reclassified bees as fish.
Sure.
It sounds ridiculous, but ultimately what they did was the reason they reclassified it is because it then put them under the Fish and Wildlife Administration. And so now funding can go to protecting and preserving bees and hives and relocation and stuff like that. But that sounds silly, right? And there are still examples of this. Like there was a period of time, I believe it was in the early 2000s, maybe the late 90s, where they redefined pizza as a vegetable because of the tomato sauce. I don't know if you remember that as part of like, maybe that was just vaguely, Florida. Yeah. Maybe that was just Florida. I don't know. Florida's just a wild place.
True.
That's, I think, part of this is understanding how legal definitions can change dependent on new research, dependent on new legislation that can redefine it. And then that's where new laws can be impacted by stuff like that.
Yeah. So much dancing around the language and interpreting it and like manipulating it. I'm like, just fix it. Like this has been treated as a living document for a long time.
Yeah.
And although people are, hard pressed to change anything about the core Constitution itself, the amendments have been redone a couple times and recreated and everything. So I'm like, just fix it. Just write it better. Like you didn't anticipate this the first time. Like write new laws so that it makes more sense. Cause we learn stuff and we grow, and trying to dance around our ignorance of the past just seems like a foolish mission to me personally.
Yeah. Yeah. So to kind of go back to Roe v. Wade, part of the ruling included that there had to be balance and that the right was not absolute. So while a woman had a right to her body and the autonomy, it was not absolute, which is why we ended up having varying state laws surrounding abortion. So right now, before Roe v. Wade may or may not get repealed, every state has abortion laws. Some are more restrictive than others, but they all exist, and you can get an abortion in every state. Like, you can. Now, is it very difficult in some states? Yes. And that's where the legalese comes in. Some of the legalese is made it be like, yeah, you can get an abortion, but you have to have X, Y, and Z in place. You have to do all these other things and meet all these requirements. And that's why you see like inhumane things like, well, you have to hear the baby's heartbeat first before, or the different things that come up in those different laws. So the ruling was that abortion was protected, that states restricting it or outright banning it was legislative overreach. However, that states could make unique and specific laws around that.
Yeah, and that's an important point, too, is that what the overturning would do is essentially allow states the freedom to write whatever laws they want around it, because the way that the law occurred at the federal level, meaning that it impacted all states. But just as you said, it gave them the wiggle room to sort of work within the parameters of that ruling. And now they're basically saying, nope, we're back to the Wild West. You can make whatever laws you want about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The main result was that legislation was to be based on trimesters, obviously how pregnancy is divided up in a sort of linear sequence of time. So, for example, in the first trimester, states could not prohibit the right to choose at any level. So, first trimester, always good. For the second trimester, reasonable health regulations could be enacted. So, they sort of could put some kind of restrictions around that period of time. Mm-hmm. And during the third trimester, abortions could be entirely prohibited as long as the law drafted included clear exceptions that were necessary to save the life or protect the health of the mother. So that was, I guess, sort of the parameters under which they could manipulate those laws.
Yeah. So just to be clear, the first few weeks you can have an abortion. There should be no restrictions on it, but they may put like, oh, you have to have a parent consent and stuff like that. And that's why some states have like those more restrictive laws. For the second trimester, they can put some in place, but not too much. And then the third trimester has to be life-saving. So essentially what all this means is that a state cannot outright ban abortion as long as Roe v. Wade is in place. But they can put what they deem, quote, reasonable restrictions on the procedures. And this is why every state has different access to abortion. And some states make it more difficult. So Texas do better. There are some states that it is nearly impossible to have an abortion without some kind of restriction in place, despite the fact that Roe v. Wade is in place. So this does exist. And Roe v. Wade is essentially kind of the dam holding the river back of all the anti-abortion laws that are going to be coming out.
Right. Yeah. And a dam is about to collapse, it looks like.
Yep. Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, it's not even that the dam is about to collapse. They're literally taking the dam away. That's what they're doing.
Oh, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it's on fire.
yeah, the dam is on fire. They've strapped it with dynamite and they have their finger over the trigger. They're ready to hit that detonate button.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, some of the things they've done within parameters were a lot of, just as you said, really long wait periods, really intensive, sort of like you had to go through counseling and try multiple times to do come back and do all this stuff. And so they were able to sort of manipulate the system to, just as you said, make it extremely, extremely difficult.
Yeah. So while we contemplate state legislation and federal versus state laws and, one of the reasons why we had the Civil War, let's go ahead and take a quick break, wrap our heads around that, and then we'll come back and talk about the types of abortions that exist.
All right, we are back. Maybe you heard an ad from one of your legislator who's pushing their abortion or anti-abortion agenda, whatever it might be. And so all very relevant. So let's talk about this.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
So we talked about types of abortions. And with all this talk about laws, we still have to ask what an abortion entails. So this is the part where we sort of have to talk through more or less some of the strategies and tactics that have been used to terminate a pregnancy.
Yeah. So an abortion is a medical procedure.
Full stop. Honestly, that's like a really important feature of this. It's like it is a medical procedure. Absolutely.
Yeah. If you take anything away from this section, just know that this is a medical procedure. Like at least legal safe abortions. Like there's all sorts of abortion-esque things that you can do that are a problem. But by definition, an abortion is a medical procedure. Historically, abortions were conducted using non-surgical applications. So we'll call them quote unquote doctors. They would prescribe or recommend engaging in highly strenuous physical activities to help terminate the pregnancy. And so they would actually ask women to lift heavy objects or to go on really long walks, which is what you hear like in late trimester where it's like, oh, you want to induce the pregnancy? Eat spicy food and go for walks, all the wives' tales that go along with that.
Yeah.
But they used to prescribe like, oh, you should go lift lift weights to get rid of this pregnancy. It's like one of the things that came up a lot.
Is this where CrossFit came from?
Yeah, this is how CrossFit started.
Okay.
Yeah, could you imagine that our abortion episode gets destroyed by CrossFit folks? Like, that's the thing that got them. It's like, they're like, no, I will tolerate all this stuff, but that is the line.
Yeah, you crossed. That was a straw that broke the camel's back. Unacceptable. All right. So there were other techniques that were used prior to the development of those surgical strategies that we mentioned. And we sort of talked about these, but that also includes one we haven't mentioned, which is fasting. Mm-hmm. So just not eating for a long period of time. That seems like that would be effective. I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be effective due to malnourishment.
Yeah, bloodletting, I guess sending your body into crisis there. Mm-hmm. Lying on a heated coconut shell. Mm-hmm. Not sure about the validity of that one. Sitting over a pot of steam or a pot of stewed onions. I think that one is courtesy of Goop and Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yeah, you can buy like a porcelain lined onion stew pot for, I don't know, $6,000.
Right, yeah. So you can sit over it while cooking your dinner.
Christ.
All the things. I know. And then finally, there were these massage abortions, which sounds pleasant, but the idea here being that there's pressure applied to the abdomen to try and induce the termination of the fetus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, today, there are more specialized techniques, and without them, actually, we would see a lot more pregnancy-related deaths. Mm-hmm. So the procedures have continued to advance. They have gotten more clinical. They have gotten more, I guess you could say, hygienic and more precise. So as you know, and this is kind of what happens with medicine and surgery and stuff like that in general, right? Like if you look at like old surgical scars versus today, it's pretty incredible what you can see. Like if you look at like old knee surgery scars as an example, like it used to be that they would just cut the front of your knee open and just bleh, like as display everything out. But now they can do it with like scopes and stuff, and they can go into like a little hole and it looks like you just have a mole instead of a giant scar along your knee.
Right.
So it's pretty impressive what has come up with medical procedures, and abortion is no different. Abortion procedures have continued to improve. So we should take a look, and we want to make sure that we are really clear about these procedures and what they are. They are currently used to result in an abortion. These are abortion-related procedures. Yeah. This is not like the movie Unplanned. If you've ever seen the movie Unplanned, for those out there, which is 100% anti-abortion propaganda. But one of the scenes is they use the vacuum aspiration, the suction abortion, what we're going to talk about, and it shows a baby fighting for its life, trying to hold on to the uterus as it's getting sucked down a tube, which is horribly insensitive.
Right.
And also not anything related to child development, or it's horrible. And actually, somebody got mad at me when I said that it was an anti-abortion propaganda movie. They're like, no, it's fact. I'm like, you think they got a camera in that uterus and watch that baby get sucked down a tube? Is that what you think happened?
Right.
No, but and it's like, okay, get out of here. So let's talk about the actual procedures based in fact in real life that people use to have an abortion.
All right, so one of these it's a drug, a medication called methotrexate and misoprostol.
I think it's misoprostol. So it's a combination of these drugs together.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And so these drugs are used in the early weeks of pregnancy, no later than 7 weeks. So you're still within that first trimester. Methotrexate as a cancer drug is designed to stop cancer cells from multiplying. So you can see what it might apply here is just to stop cells from multiplying. And misoprostol, did I say that right that time?
Yeah, I think it's what it is. I always have a hard time with like medication terms.
Yeah.
Because there are always different ways to pronounce it.
Right. Yeah. So misoprostol, assuming I'm saying that correctly, contracts the uterus to help it release its contents. So sort of a mix of like stop growing, start excreting stuff.
And again, that's taken in the first 7 weeks. It's not usually applied after that first 7 weeks.
Yeah.
Now, there is officially the term medical abortion, and the medical abortion is a combination of those two medications. They interact to end pregnancy, and this can be used up to 10 weeks into your pregnancy. But when they do this, there's also a medical procedure where they help kind of remove some of the tissues and stuff like that. Not necessarily through suction, but like some different procedures and they have to monitor it because it's not always as effective. Leading up to those 7 weeks, it's fairly effective, but after that 7 weeks, it's not quite as effective, and they have to monitor a different way.
Got it. Well, and so speaking of suction, which I believe you said, the next one is the one that I think most people probably have heard about because this is the one that is used in most sort of scare tactic fear campaigns, and this is vacuum aspiration or suction abortion.
Yep.
This is a procedure done within the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. Okay, an important number there. First 12 weeks, still in the first trimester. This is done in a clinic. They use a device that includes a small suction mechanism. They use that to remove the fetus and the placenta from the uterus. The procedure is not described as painful, but usually takes a couple of days, 1 to 2 days for sort of recovery for the woman. And I think anything where they're sticking stuff into your body is usually going to be a fairly invasive procedure, is going to require some amount of recovery, almost no matter what it is.
Yeah.
So we don't heal like Wolverine,
Yeah. And they say this procedure takes anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes. It's not a very long procedure because, ultimately at 12 weeks, you do not have something that could live on its own. It is a very small clump of cells at that time. The procedure itself, it is invasive, but it is a fairly quick procedure. You can do it under local anesthetic, or you can do it fully under, like you can be put under to do that. Either one is fine.
Yeah.
Typically, it really depends on your doctor and your choice at that point in time.
Yeah.
And also, it's a shame that it's always made to kind of sound as bad as it is. There are suction procedures in every surgery. Like, truly, they use those types of tools. Like when you're having surgery, if you've ever been to a dentist, you have a suction thing in your mouth.
It's true.
Right? So it's very similar to that, but it's not even as powerful. And so, yeah, it's not quite as scary as people make it out to be.
Mine's just a straw that someone else is sucking on.
Oh, God. That's what happens when you go to the dentist without insurance.
Just kidding. I have a wonderful dentist that use very appropriate tools.
Appreciate that. Thank you for clarifying that, because that image really bummed me out.
Sorry to make jokes in this topic. Bringing a little levity feels like it's important. So
yeah. We are still very aware of the sensitivity of this. So
right.
But yeah, we do need a little bit of levity because it is a tough conversation. Now,
it is.
Another procedure is dilation and evacuation. And in this procedure, what they do is they dilate the cervix, and the tissues that are related to the fetus are removed from the uterus using forceps and suction tools. So they may have to remove several larger bits of tissue and the placenta as well using forceps and those suction tools.
Did you see where in the pregnancy this might occur?
I believe this happens in the second trimester.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. And then there's induction abortion. This is a later stage sort of abortion. This is when you're well into the second trimester. This requires the woman to be induced into labor, obviously prematurely. Additional procedures may be used to remove additional tissues once the initial stages of the abortion are complete, but it's essentially it's just an early pregnancy when the fetus is not viable. It's just not going to survive the birth, if you will.
And we're going to talk about different reasons why women have abortions as well, and that is one of them.
It's important.
Where the fetus has passed away, there's no longer heartbeat, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we're going to share a story specifically about that. That is one of the ones that you'll see in later trimesters. And then the last one, and this is one we're going to also debunk under the myth-busting portion of this, is the term late-term abortions. And this is often used as arguments against abortion.
Right.
You'll see this come up a lot. As a matter of fact, there was a recent hearing, I believe it was maybe a Senate hearing or a House hearing, where they had interviewed a doctor, and they're like, at 9 months, when the woman is in labor and she's about to give birth, are you saying that you could induce an abortion there? It's like, that doesn't make any sense. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So like the baby is on the way out. At that point in time, we would just have the baby and then figure out what to do then.
Right.
So essentially what a late-term abortion is, they are banned in most states unless the mother's life is at risk. And that goes back to those specific arrangements in that third trimester Roe v. Wade argument. And there's no agreed upon definition for what constitutes the term or is considered late. That ends up being kind of a state thing. With some folks arguing after 20 weeks and some after 24 weeks. So there's about a 4-week period. And there are several reasons why somebody might decide on having a late-term abortion. One, you had trouble deciding whether to have an abortion, and maybe it took a little bit of time. And at that point in time, it may be too late, and the doctor may not do that. That does not protect your rights if you are at 26 weeks that you could say that. Financial reasons prevented you from accessing to an abortion because a lot of states don't offer access. Planned Parenthood is an easy access organization, but there's still a cost to those services.
Yeah.
You're underage and afraid to tell your parents. The fetus isn't viable, or there's a serious medical condition, which we are going to share a story about that later.
Yeah, very important.
And when I say viable, I mean the fetus has maybe passed away, and now it's become a toxicity issue.
Right.
Or the pregnancy puts your health at risk. And those are different reasons why you might have a late-term abortion. But we're going to get into a lot of those in the next episode as well.
Yes. So I think that covers essentially the scope of what we wanted to tackle today, because next time when we come back, we're going to talk more about some of the reasons that women get abortions. We're going to talk about the psychological impact of the whole process, really, because there's not only the psychological impact of having an abortion, but also carrying a baby to term is kind of a traumatic thing to put your body through.
Yeah.
And then one of my favorite things, we're going to definitely do some myth busting in large doses, which is very important because the amount of misinformation about this rivals that even of vaccines. It is kind of incredible how much ignorant nonsense is floating around that is treated as being common knowledge and is absolutely false.
And many times that information is shared through theological means, unfortunately.
That makes sense.
I mean, we've already put that to rest earlier where there's very little, if any, mention of abortion in the Bible, but specifically that it is not banned or illegal or a problem. God is fine with it.
Yeah. Not a rock band or an indie band. No kind of band.
Nope. No band.
You said band. I had to try and sneak a pun in there.
Yeah, it worked. It was good. I like it.
Thanks. All right. So with that being said, let's go ahead and close out today's discussion, and we will come back next week to follow up and finish out our talk about abortion, as we just said, all those things that we're going to be bringing up. So in the meantime, I think we have some recommendations.
Yep.
Recommendations.
Normally I like to recommend something fun, but I also kind of want to be mindful of like what recommendations I'm giving that might be associated with this topic and how they might not want that. And so what I am going to recommend is Planned Parenthood. We've mentioned a little bit. And I think what's important to understand about Planned Parenthood and what I'm actually recommending here is they do a ton that is unrelated to abortions. Matter of fact, I think if I remember correctly, I've heard some statistics that suggested that that's like a relatively small percentage of what they do. And many of the Planned Parenthood clinics don't actually do the abortions. They might just help connect someone with a provider. A lot of them will do things like helping with STIs, helping with contraception. They'll provide low cost, just medical help to women who don't have medical insurance, who just need stuff like, I have body parts that need help. And this is not actually unique to women. They provide services for men as well. They provide support for the LGBTQ plus population. And so I guess what I'm really recommending here is support your Planned Parenthood. Stop by and give them a hug or send them some cookies or something. Maybe don't send them cookies. They'll probably think they're laced with something. But honestly, the thing you can probably do that helps the most is just donating to them. That's, I think, where my recommendation is.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. If you feel strongly about this.
I do.
And I do too. If you really want to help, I mean, another resource is the abortionfunds.org, which is the national network of abortion funds. And what they do is they connect you with services. So that's another kind of like bonus recommendation on top of this. Since we were talking about some of the legal stuff, I do strongly recommend, and this is just an action. This is not necessarily any sort of resource or anything. I recommend the action of looking up voting records of your representatives and your senators.
I like this.
Because there's many times where you might go in and you're like, I really like this person. They vote along my turn, and you'll find out that they voted against your interests, especially around this. So there are a lot of resources out there that you can actually like go in and look up, like, how has my representative voted along abortion laws? And they will give you a full record of what the law said, why they voted, like maybe not why they voted against it, but they'll give you like did they vote for it or against it and stuff like that. And I strongly recommend that only because I think it's important to know who's making these decisions.
Yeah.
Right now, with Roe v. Wade in place, these decisions are state-based decisions. And what is going to happen is when Roe v. Wade gets pulled, they are going to become even more prominent in like state legislation, right? You're going to see more laws coming up. You're going to see more people speaking out against this.
Yeah.
Because the dam is gone. And so I strongly recommend looking up voting records of the people that are in your district or jurisdiction, because you'd be surprised what people will vote for and vote against.
Absolutely. And what's important too, I think, in there is, as of this recording, we're in the midst of a lot of local elections. Like that's sort of the year this is going on. And obviously that won't be the case in the future, but the local elections and stuff are a place where a lot of those decisions are going to be made. And one of the places where you're not usually voting in an electoral system where your vote counts 1-to-1, because that's how voting should work. And it's ridiculous that it would ever not work that way. But yeah, so looking up your politicians, seeing what their voting record is, being able to actually select the people that vote and align with your interests and things that you value is really important. I love that recommendation. I
think ultimately, if this is a strong value for you, then you might cast your votes based on that. Like, you're not going to find a perfect politician. And I think that we could talk about that all day.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to know like what your strong values are and whether or not those representatives are voting along your strong values.
And another thing too is a lot of them, when they write these laws that are in sort of these smaller elections, is like they're more concerned about sensational headlines than they are writing legal laws that actually make practical sense when you start looking at what are the implications of this. I want to talk a little bit more about the implications of some of these laws as they're coming up that I think are extremely counterproductive to the people who are in favor of those laws in certain ways. And so I think, again, it's when you just go whole hog of like, what's the way that I can get the most people riled up? You tend to write sloppy laws that have adverse consequences.
Yeah.
And then like bad things happen. And so it's important to sort of be in the know, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, we dragged that out like 10 minutes. So let's go ahead and wrap this one up. I definitely want to say thank you to the people who helped make this happen. That includes Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Hopefully this did not make you want to leave. And then, of course, thank you so much to my team, which is Justin, Selena, Kyle, Allen. And thank you for your work on these notes and for recording with me today, Shane.
Hey, anytime. This is actually a very interesting set of notes to put together.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, thank you everyone for listening. As I mentioned at the top, if you would like to support us, the financial ways you can do that are buying merch, making a donation, or joining us on Patreon. If you join us on Patreon, there's all kinds of perks and bonuses that come along with that. Another way you can support us is just by telling somebody. And of course, leaving us a 5-star wonderful rating and review saying like, where has this been all my life? And then trying to direct people to that as something as well. I think that's pretty much it. If you would like to tell us your opinions about abortions or about anything that we got wrong, or you'd like to make a contribution, please be civil and nice, and we will 100% listen to you in those situations, understanding like we might have different political values and open to hearing what people have to say. So feel free to reach out to us. And of course, if you'd like to tell us we got it completely right, we're happy to hear that too. You can always reach us at info@wwdpodcast.com or message us on social media at that same handle. So I think that is all of my wrap-up stuff. Do you have anything else?
Nope. I'm looking forward to part 2.
Perfect. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.